Welcome to another episode of Wildcat Career Chat. I am David Bennett, the Central High School engineering teacher, and we are here in our Central High School podcast studio. I'm here today with Dr. Ryan Seidemann. We're going to talk about his interesting and kind of unique career.
It is.
I don't actually know how I should introduce what it is that you do. So I could say, how would you introduce?
I don't know that I know either. It's a constant struggle for everybody. So I'm an attorney and an archaeologist, and that's probably the most basic way of putting it. But I suppose to get hyper technical, I am a bioarchaeologist that deals with post-disaster dead people problems.
Dead people problems.
Yeah, dead people problems.
Okay, so you said you're a attorney, but you're also a archaeologist.
Yeah.
Okay, so as when you did your education, which came first, I guess is the question.
The archaeology came first.
Okay.
I actually started out as a film major. I thought I'd be the next Steven Spielberg.
Of course.
But I took a class in anthropology, really just on a whim, and fell in love with it, and changed the whole course of my college experience and changed the whole course of my life.
Wow.
So that definitely came first.
Okay. So. And so what about archaeology got you so excited? What made you want to make that change?
Well,
other than Indiana Jones.
That's it. I was going to say there are two answers to that question. There's the answer that you kind of hang your head in shame and blush about, and there's the answer that is the real answer that people should hear.
Okay.
The first one is, Indiana Jones. I grew up in the 80s. I loved those movies, and there is no question that is why, on a whim, I took an anthropology course.
Okay.
And in fact, because of that, I've learned that there are a lot of people in my profession that have the same history. I actually wrote an article about it several years ago titled something like, "Maybe Indiana Jones isn't that bad," because it attracted a whole generation of people to archaeology. But the better answer, and it is true, is that anthropology writ large, which includes archaeology, is such a wide-ranging examination of humanity, culturally, linguistically, the past. It's almost irresistible in terms of its scope and the kinds of things you can study. So
okay, so it's just you were interested in all of the different things about history, and so you were a history fan then.
Yeah, there's no question about that. Yeah, okay. It definitely came from that.
Okay, and so after you've got your was it an archaeology degree?
It was anthropology.
Anthropology degree. Yeah. Okay. What's the difference between? I know you said one falls under the other. What's the difference?
So in American anthropology, which is different from there's a European school, mostly British, and there's an American school of anthropology. Largely the same theoretical concepts and underlying ideas, but the way they go about the education is different. So in the United States, it is what's called a four-field approach to anthropology. And the four fields are sociocultural anthropology, linguistics, which is mind-numbingly difficult, like I can't get my brain around it, archaeology, and biological anthropology. Okay. And biological anthropology is the bones part of the field. Whereas if you go to school in the UK or in Europe, you actually do get a degree in archaeology. Okay. It's a much more concentrated thing. So in the United States, it's casting a broad net, especially at the undergrad level. Elsewhere, you're going to be an archaeologist and know down this really thin tunnel.
Okay.
So,
And so you said your concentration was the bones, right?
so I sit in a weird spot covering two different subfields of anthropology. My degrees all say anthropology, the big field. My specializations were what's called biological anthropology, and within that, even more technical, is bioarchaeology,
Okay.
which is the examination of and the study of human remains to interpret past cultures or past people from the bones.
Okay.
So that includes both the bones component and the digging archaeology component.
Okay.
So the degree says anthropology, the license that I have says archaeology, and I'm somewhere in between the two.
Okay. So after you got that degree, did you go straight on to getting your next degrees, or was it?
It was pretty close. Yeah, I worked as a professional archaeologist starting while I was an undergrad at 19, which is unusual. I'm still not sure how I got that. And so I was actually doing actual archaeology to pay the bills and pay for food in college and getting paid for it, which was nice. And it was
Yeah.
paying much better than, your average college job.
So what does that job look like? What do you do as a professional?
It's a fair question, and most people don't think that anything like this exists because the whole popular notion of archaeology is really Egyptology or something like that.
Right.
But archaeology is very much a part of the modern world and how things get built, really. So, under existing federal law in the United States, there's a requirement for any projects that get federal funding to watch out that they're not going to destroy significant historic or archaeological sites in the process of that construction. So, road widenings, pipelines, buildings, you name it. And so, a market has sprung up since the 1960s in private industry where these consulting companies will get contracted out on government projects and they hire archaeologists, usually fresh out of school, to go out and survey the whole area where the project is going to be. And by survey, in that sense, it means you dig a hole about every 90 feet and see if you come up with anything. You screen the dirt out, and if there's something artifact wise in there, then you kind of grow out from there to see what you found. More often than not, you're not finding anything, but the purpose is to make sure that you don't tear through a significant site with that construction project. And so that was the kind of stuff that we were doing. I worked all over the southeastern U.S.
Okay.
From Florida to Louisiana, up to Tennessee, and then did a small stint in Indiana.
So to sum that up, the archaeologists are before we build a bridge or a building or whatever, they're just trying to make sure that we don't lose something of historical significance that we could learn from.
Correct.
And so try to find those things.
Yep.
Okay.
So I did that for a little while.
Yeah. That's really cool. Did you get to find anything pretty cool? Or was it not so much?
The great bulk of it is not so much. But occasionally you got to work on really neat things. We had a site that we worked on in North Louisiana, outside of Natchitoches, that had it was a habitation site. So it was just a place that Native Americans had come to spend a season, but repeatedly. And it had been occupied for thousands of years seasonally. And so we were able to excavate. This was going to be a reservoir project, and so now it's a fully underwater.
Yeah.
But we were able to excavate this site that had a history going back 6,000 years and find things that people during their time at that place used in their everyday life. And so that kind of, connection to the way back history was cool.
Yeah.
It really was. So that was enjoyable. A lot of the survey work, though, you're not finding much. I mean, occasionally you will find something, but,
Right.
it's
Well, I mean, I guess it's kind of like, doing a metal detector. You walk around, most of the land that you're going to search you're not going to find gold, but
Yep.
maybe eventually you will.
It's a very good characterization.
Okay, good. Good. I'm glad I did that. So after you got your first degree, what made you want to continue on, and what did you end up doing? Like,
So when I was doing my undergrad, I went to Florida State, and at the time they had an 8,000-year-old skeletal collection there. It was a Native American collection that had been excavated in the 1980s right near Cape Canaveral. Matter of fact, there were I of course was in elementary school when it was done, but there were stories of the archaeologists digging and then stopping to watch the space shuttles launch just a few miles away and then going back to digging.
wow.
But it was what's called a mortuary pond that they were working in. It was a cemetery site that was used for a period of 2,000 years, between 8,000 years ago and 6,000 years ago. And the archaic Native Americans that lived in the community there would walk out into what was a pond back then, that had deep peat deposits at the bottom. And they would kind of part the peat and put the bodies of their dead loved ones in there. And this was how they buried their dead. And the neat thing for us was that environment preserved the human remains like you don't see anywhere else in the world.
Right.
And
I think I've heard of this. It's like the peat bog.
Yeah. And so you see them in Europe, some Middle Ages bodies that come out of the peat bogs. That material preserves remains really well. And so this one, they excavated 170 individuals from it. 91 of them had brain material, still present soft tissue, and until very recently was the oldest replicated human DNA in the world.
Oh, wow.
This was the collection that I got to learn on. And I was spoiled and starstruck, and because it had been on National Geographic and all kinds of stuff, and I fell in love with the whole idea of everything that would be done with it. So I decided this is what I wanted to do with my life, and really from there it was looking for the next place to go educationally to keep doing it. So I ended up at LSU for my master's degree. And I'm from New Orleans originally, so it was kind of a coming home for me.
Okay.
So I did my master's degree there at LSU, and there I worked on some skeletal remains from the Maya area in Belize, and analyzed an entire site's population that was a few hundred years old, so much more recent.
Okay.
So, for a master's degree, in a lot of cases, not always, but in a lot of cases, you have to write a big paper at the end of it, a thesis. And so that was the subject of my thesis, was that sample and, who they were and what we could tell from the bones of who they were, ages, biological sex, what kind of stuff they ate. Did they live a harsh life?
Right.
And try to glean as much information about these people as we could from the remains to tell their story, hundreds of years later.
That's cool.
It was neat.
Yeah. So you got your master's at LSU. What happened after that? What did you...
It was a weird thing. I took a left turn after that. I had thought that I would go on to be a college professor. I'd go and do a PhD and look for professorship positions. And again, on a whim, I applied to law school, partially because there was a lot of interaction at the time. This was the right around 2000. There was a lot of interaction at the time between laws that were being made both at the state level and in Congress that impacted what I was doing scientifically.
Okay.
And so, I started to get interested in how those things interacted, how government actors could control how science was or wasn't done. And so I thought, I've got an interesting little skill set in knowing how the science works. Let me go figure out how the law works.
Okay.
So I kind of stumbled into law school that way, and also at LSU.
Yeah.
So that was a 3-year interesting experience. It was a very different thing from what I had been used to in doing, the
Right.
most scientific end of what is the social sciences as you could get, to going to a very theoretical law thing.
So at law school, are there a lot of folks in law school that have some kind of a different background other than, pre-law or whatever it is that?
Surprisingly, there are. I was the only one in my cohort, and I think at the time the incoming classes were 150 to 200 students. I was the only one in that group with an anthropology, archaeology background, but there were chemists, there were folks that had done stuff in medicine, and so as a matter of fact, we've always been told, and I've never known for sure, but we've always been told that the admissions folks for law schools are really attracted to a varied background of students, so that you don't just get the ones that are being groomed and planning to do law school for their whole career, that you get these folks with other backgrounds, and it brings in a broader perspective to everything in their class.
Well, I think it's interesting to think about that, because when you hear somebody, oh, I'm a lawyer, you think of somebody who just wants to be in trials or whatever, but there's other aspects to law other than you need people who understand science or math or economics or whatever it is within the law field, so that they can practice the laws appropriately.
I think that's right. And I think that, I'd argue that varied background is even more crucial than most people would think. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. In part, I got to do what I loved doing as an undergrad and for my master's degree. And then I got to apply that to the law and create this really small world of legal stuff. And, so everybody that comes in with that kind of passion into a law program and wants to focus on the law as it relates to their field can kind of build that organically themselves. And it's really kind of cool. And it does give those lawyers really interesting perspectives on how to practice law in particular areas. And, especially from a science and engineering background, there are certain types of law you cannot practice without having undergrad degrees in science or engineering. Patent law, stuff for inventions, intellectual property. You can't even go into that area of the law. You can't even get a license without an engineering or a science degree.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
I guess I never really thought about it.
And I mean, it makes sense when you think about it, because so much of that stuff, of the world of inventions is either hyper-technical biotech, which seems to be the broad bulk of it these days, or engineering. And if it's something else, you can usually pick that up. But those specialized fields, that extra training it's crucial.
Right. Right.
So, yeah. And so you're right. There are a lot of varied backgrounds that come into it. And like I said, I think that makes for a richer class of lawyers coming out.
Okay. And then, so now you've got your law degree and you've got your anthropology background. What did you do immediately after? I know you said you were able to kind of create some things. You were able to make some.
It took a long time.
Yeah.
I knew that, number one, going into law school, even though I was interested in it, I didn't want to be a lawyer. And so even coming out of law school, I didn't want to practice law. I wanted to do something. I didn't know what, but something else that didn't require me to show up in court every day. I eventually did do that, but that was it's just a part of the circuitous path of life. But so when I was in law school, I learned that the world of the law that incorporates what I did, archaeology, um, is it's such a small area that it's incorporated within a bigger area of the law of historic preservation. And that's incorporated within a bigger area of the law that's environmental law. And that's most people understand what, environmental law is writ large. It's, dealing with the interactions of everyday activities and the environment. And, not necessarily from an environmentalist perspective. I mean, there's a whole spectrum of folks that do that, from defense of, oil and gas companies to defense of communities that are having issues with environmental problems. And I fell somewhere in between. I got a job in law school working for an environmental law think tank that was and still is based at LSU. So by the time I finished law school, I wanted to do environmental law. It was fascinating to me. It incorporated what I had trained for already, but then it also broadened my horizons. While I was working at LSU in the think tank, I was able to do, work on shipwreck law. And it was great, and so
That's crazy. That's so cool.
Yeah, it dovetailed back into my archaeology. And then the odd thing is, as you mentioned, I kind of went this weird route to create this job that I had. And, that shipwreck component came back a few times.
Okay.
We had several shipwreck cases that I worked on. So yeah, it's an interesting path. It's an interesting thing. But yeah, so I came out of law school really wanting to be a backroom researcher and writer in law, not wanting to go to court. I ended up getting a job at Louisiana Department of Justice, the Attorney General's office, so back in 2005, right before Hurricane Katrina. And they did hire me to do environmental and natural resources law. And so I was kind of getting my feet wet at that time, it was a lot of oil and gas contamination cases from the state's perspective, trying to protect the resource that was impacted. And then along came Hurricane Katrina, and everybody's life changed. I mean, not just, in our office, but in most of the state. And so I shifted then to having to do, we kind of lovingly called it trash law, but it was law of debris.
Oh, wow.
As a storm comes through and it leaves this path of destruction, what do you do with the stuff? Because the stuff goes everywhere, and people ended up with boats in their houses and houses on their front lawns.
Yeah.
And so, I started to branch out into disaster law, and while still keeping a finger in the environmental natural resources law. And as things calmed down after Katrina, that area just kind of stuck around. And where we are, we get hit by storms from time to time.
Right.
So that component of what I do never really went away. It just evolved over time. But then, there were also just a lot of kind of serendipitous things that happened. We got a call out of the blue one day from the National Park Service. And they said, hey, somebody is selling a human skull on eBay. The FBI doesn't have the time to deal with this, but it's in Louisiana. Y'all want to go deal with that? What?
Yeah.
That was the call that you don't ever expect to get.
Right.
And with my background in human remains, I thought, this is amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, this is what I've been trained for.
Absolutely. I mean, it really was. And so we ended up, I'm not a criminal lawyer, not by any stretch of the imagination. If anybody ever hired me to keep them out of jail, they'd go straight to jail. um, uh, but but we did, with the Attorney General's office, it's a statewide office, and it has its own investigation wing. It has its own criminal wing, and so we all worked together to figure out who the seller was. There was a guy out of Lake Charles who had inherited a big collection of stuff, and in this big collection of stuff were human remains that this guy had just kind of dug up.
Oh, wow.
And this guy didn't know, that it was illegal to sell these things, so he put them up on eBay for sale.
Okay.
And we intercepted it. It ended up being a Native American skull. And after we intercepted it, we worked with all of the tribes in Louisiana to ask them, look, what's the appropriate thing with this? What do you guys want us to do?
How do we properly and respectfully take care of this item?
Correct. And so
or individual, I guess we should say.
In that case, it was definitely an individual. And it was interesting because part of the process of figuring out who to talk to and ask those questions of what is the appropriate thing to do, you've got to know which tribes to talk to. And so, this brought back in my training of doing bone analysis, and we were able to narrow it down that based upon features of the skull, morphology of the skull, we knew that it was a middle-aged woman. And we had pretty good evidence that she was from somewhere in the lower Mississippi Valley. So Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, something like that. But we didn't know how old. We actually were able to take a dirt sample that was lodged in one of the ear canals. And we had somebody analyze that dirt, and it came back at 4,000 years old. Doesn't mean that the skull was 4,000 years old, the person was 4,000 years old, but the land she was buried in certainly was. And it came back consistent with it being from the Mississippi floodplain.
Yeah.
So that, told us where to look and who to talk to about this thing. So anyway, that skull seizure started our office onto what became a 15-year program of policing the sale of human remains, which is a thing in Louisiana. And lots of seizures and lots of, discussions with descendant communities. And then you combine that with the disaster stuff, and all of a sudden you start getting calls whenever there's a storm, and cemeteries get hit, and bodies start to float, as they do in Louisiana.
Yeah.
And so all of that, the law, the archaeology, all of it morphed into we became, and I had several colleagues that worked with me, both lawyers and archaeologists, but we became kind of a clearinghouse in the state for all of the dead people problems that nobody knew what else to do with.
Yeah. So you said bodies float as they do in Louisiana. So let's just kind of illustrate that for a second real quick. So when we have a flood, there's a reason that in New Orleans they tend to put them on, the tombs on top of the ground rather than deep under the ground. Yeah.
So that's an interesting point that you bring up, and that's what most people believe, that the above ground burial is because the ground is so soggy you can't put them in the ground. But in fact, in New Orleans and the surrounding areas, there's a lot of in-ground burial. And it's all cultural practice. And so for example, in Jewish faiths, there's a very strong belief of being in contact with the soil after death. And so all of the Jewish cemeteries in New Orleans, going back as far as the history of the city, goes, they're all in ground.
Okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, it's a very common myth, but it is that. And so all of the above ground tombs there, and we have a lot of them up here too.
Yeah.
It's just a cultural practice. It's a preference of that community.
Okay.
And so what we, to get back to the floating remains situation, folks around here probably best remember this from the 2016 floods that covered the central southwest eastern part of the state. And with those above ground burials, they surprisingly tend to float. They're usually in concrete things. They're called vaults that are put on top of the ground or slightly buried in the ground, and they're sealed. And those things just become big air pockets. And so when floodwaters come through, just the physics of what's going on interacting with that, what you would think would be a very heavy thing, concrete, usually about 2 tons worth of concrete and casket and body. It floats like a cork.
Yeah, it floats like a boat. I mean, a boat can be very heavy, but it still
Absolutely.
floats.
No, it's a good point. No, that's absolutely right. And so that's what happens around here. If it's simply, I say simply, there's nothing simple about it, but if it is a flood that's just rivers rising, like we saw in 2016, then a lot of the above ground burials will float like a cork, like a boat. But if it's a hurricane or something like that, what you're seeing usually is a storm surge. And that stuff, the power of water is not to be believed. And it will take a 2-ton concrete burial vault and push it miles. And after Hurricane Laura in 2020, we found one person whose casket came to rest 8 miles from where they had been buried. Storm surge carried them that far.
Wow.
It's wild. It's really beyond comprehension.
Right. Yeah. And I can't imagine what would go through the mind of the person who wakes up or goes back to their house after the storm, because hopefully they evacuated, and they find there's a casket in my front yard that weighs 2 tons.
Yeah.
Who do I call? What do I do?
That's literally what happened after 2016, because that one was so localized here in this area. And because it wasn't a storm surge, it was just a flood event, the caskets floated and they kind of meandered their own way. And so, in Denham Springs, there's a cemetery called Denham Memorial, and that one had a lot of tombs that opened up because, again, it's just these big air pockets. And so sometimes the concrete part doesn't go anywhere, but if the lid has any kind of breach in its seal, that air wants out so bad, and it'll pop up that lid, and air comes out, and a lot of times the casket comes with it.
Oh, wow.
And so we did get calls that around that one, there literally were caskets in people's yards, in their carports. What do we do? And, in that case, we work with the local, usually public works department, to bring out a crane and lift it off of people's property. Another example in Livingston Parish in 2016 floods, and this was a situation, so much of the 2016 floods, people didn't evacuate because it was a slow-moving event. And we found a bunch of tombs that had floated into a trailer park. There was a church across the street. And, when we asked the community what happened, because they couldn't get out, they couldn't open their doors because these 2-ton vaults were sitting against them.
Oh, wow.
And, we went out there and we're pulling the stuff off. And, we said, what happened here? And they said that it was just unreal. All the power had gone out, so there were no street lights, no nothing. And they said the only thing that they could see was when there was a lightning flash. And they knew there was the church and a cemetery across the road, and they were watching out their windows. Every time the lightning flashed, they could see these things that looked like boats floating towards them. And as they got closer, they realized these were the people in their caskets and in their vaults from that cemetery that were floating across the road, across a pond into their community.
Wow.
And they told us that there was a retention pond by the neighborhood, and they said, we think we saw one as it was going across that pond. And this is literally how they explained it to me. They said, we saw the thing coming, and it must have hit a snag or something, because it stopped, and then it turned like the Titanic and went straight down. And sure enough, we ended up dragging that pond with police divers and found somebody. And it was the somebody from the cemetery. It wasn't,
Right.
a criminal event. But yeah, so so you're right. They're absolutely, literally ending up at people's doorsteps, and they're waking up to this reality of, sometimes they're dead community members, their loved ones
Yeah.
that are now sitting right at their doorstep. And it's jarring, it's upsetting, it's strange.
Yeah. I mean, it's something out of a Halloween story,
Yeah.
But I think the important thing to point out is that you, with your expertise, you were able to help them figure out who this person was.
Yeah.
Take care of the legalities of the issue because you had that expertise too, and correct the situation.
Yeah, and that's what it really became. It became this skill set of being able to deal with the legal limitations of what you can do or what you have to do with human remains. Working through that legal process while at the same time trying to identify who these people are, because they don't come with their name, stitched on the outside of the casket.
Right.
And so we were having to do, real forensic work on every one of these people. And in the flood event in 16, it was 800 graves that were impacted. And so that becomes just a monumental task. The best and most rewarding part of it is when you get to call a family member who knows their loved one has gone away somewhere and tell them that you've positively identified them, you got them, and they're coming back.
Yeah.
And the relief on the other end of that phone line is so wonderful. That it makes all of the hard work, and it does get to be gross sometimes, very worthwhile.
Yeah.
So yeah, and again, it's a weird coincidence of education that brought me to that.
Yeah.
And so I did that for 19 years, and somewhere in the process, did my doctorate as well.
Yeah, that was the next thing I was going to ask. I said, so you got your law degree, and then somewhere along the way you got your doctorate. What did you get your doctorate in? Like, what is
so? As a technical matter, my doctorate is in urban studies, and that's kind of an accidental reality. The doctoral program at the University of New Orleans, which is where I did my PhD, in urban studies actually takes in multiple departments. And there's a lot of overlap between those, the anthropology and urban studies fields. And so the anthropology faculty have their students go through the urban studies program. Okay. So it meant I had to take a bunch of extra classes in urban planning, design, all that kind of stuff. But again, still, my focus was at that time less on the bones of the dead as on their burial places.
Okay.
So and that too was, so the research I did was the interactions of development and urban design on the dead, and especially the underprivileged dead, and this reality that their burial places over time get built over. And this is something that Katrina laid bare in New Orleans as it wiped structures off the map. We learned that, wait a second, there are whole cemeteries underneath some of these.
Oh, wow.
And that became a whole new mess of all of it that had to be dealt with after Katrina for rebuilding purposes. But anyway, that's what I did my doctoral work on. And so, yeah, I did that while I was working full time at the Attorney General's office. So I had been out of school for 14 years and just decided to go back. It was just kind of a personal thing. It wasn't going to result in any financial gain that I knew of at the time. Eventually it did, but and so I did. I was also teaching at the time, so I was a full-time lawyer, a part-time university professor, and a part-time doctoral student. So that degree went from 2017 to 2021, so yeah,
So you did it for personal. You wanted to be able to have that doctorate on the or
I
PhD
did.
at the end of the name.
I did. The unfortunate legacy that I lived with, which I just made worse for my kids, is that I was at the time before I went back and did my PhD, I was the third generation of some kind of doctor in the family. My grandfather was a physician in New York. My father he also had a PhD in audiology. He was an ear doctor.
Oh, okay.
And that's how we ended up here. He got a teaching position at Tulane.
Okay.
So, and my aunt also, his sister was a medical doctor. So, no pressure. But there wasn't any. And my parents didn't do that. But it was just something that I felt like I had never finished. And I wanted to go back and do it for myself.
Okay.
So I did. And then I got to, joke with my father that I finally had more degrees than he did.
Yeah. So as you also mentioned that you've done some teaching at the college level. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So yeah, after I finished law school and was working full time, I got an adjunct professor appointment at Southern University's Law Center, teaching law school, and I love it. They're really, and this is very individual specific, but I being able to talk about the stuff that you're interested in and tell people and teach people about it is just it's awesome. It's an amazing thing. And it has really become another part of my identity. So yeah, I've taught law classes at Southern for 13 years, mostly property law, which is related to what I was doing for the Attorney General's office. But then some of the areas that I don't practice in too, matrimonial regimes, which is who gets what when a divorce happens.
Oh, wow.
But it's a variation on property law. And then I also do teach successions law, which is who gets what when somebody dies, which relates a little bit more back to what I do.
Right.
So I've been doing that for 13 years. And then after I finished my PhD, University of New Orleans asked me to come on to the part-time faculty there. So I also teach in two departments at UNO, urban planning and urban studies, and anthropology. So truly returned to my roots because, although I got my undergrad degree from Florida State, I actually started at UNO as an undergrad at 17. So completely full circle. Started there at 17, came back and finished my PhD there, and I'm now teaching in the same classes that I sat in.
Right.
Which is it's entertaining, and again, it's just a blast.
Yeah.
Because the students at that point, that they want to be there and they want to learn this stuff. So, and what I was telling my class last night, I was teaching historic preservation last night at UNO. I said, everything that you guys bring to this class is new to me because your experiences are so different. And from what I've experienced, that number one, every time I teach the class, it's something new.
Yeah.
And that those personal experiences they all bring to the class makes it special and fascinating.
Yeah.
So I do a little teaching.
Yeah, that's cool. So I feel like the theme that I'm getting from this episode is like you've been kind of chasing things that you just like, this is interesting. And you've made a very interesting, fulfilling, successful career out of just finding things that you were interested in, right?
And that is the one unifying factor to all of it. You're right. I chased what I was interested in. That's it. And yeah, I happened to be able to pay my bills and put food on the table. But the reality is that every day going into work, it's not work. It's fun. I
Yeah.
get to go play and do what I like to do. And I've left the state since recently, but I have got a position that now also supports both of those backgrounds, and gives me a good bit more leeway to do the research into stuff.
Okay.
So I did go through, I had mentioned that before when we were talking about law school. I did go through the process of being a real lawyer, going to court, arguing cases, and I found out that I didn't hate it as much as I thought I would.
Right.
And in fact, for the appeals, I really enjoyed those. So, I guess all of that is to say, don't ever scratch off the, I don't want to be a lawyer and, chase ambulances, whatever. It's not necessarily going to be the case. And I sure didn't want to be a lawyer. But I learned that there's really some fun stuff, even not with the weird that I used to do there with the state, but just with everyday lawyering. There was just a fun to the arguing, to the coming up with positions and arguing your case.
Right. And it puts a different perspective on what does it mean to be a lawyer when you're not just defending a defendant. You're trying to make things that you care about happen. Right.
That was really the threshold question for me was, am I doing something that I can go home and sleep comfortably at night? That I've not done something that would harm people or harm the environment or anything like that. And working in government for me was that. I got to walk that line of not being in a position to exploit people or exploit the environment, but feel like on a very small level, admittedly, that I was, helping to make a difference, kind of doing, my part in an environmental context. And that, too, was fulfilling. It was a good thing.
Yeah. So I guess we can start to wrap things up a little bit. So if a student is watching this and they said, I'm interested in, say, archaeology, what would you recommend for them to do in high school or to start preparing for some kind of a career in archaeology-related stuff?
The good thing about archaeology is, in many ways, it's kind of like law. You don't have to have a background in it to do it. And it doesn't hurt to have taken your fair share of history classes and even some of the science classes. And there's so many facets to that field that, folks now that enjoy chemistry, that enjoy physics, that enjoy biology are all able to bring their fields of interest to bear in archaeology. And there are, applications across all of those sciences in the field. So, if that's something you're interested in, and unlike me, I couldn't do the math for chemistry and physics. And so that's a good point. Don't rule yourself out of archaeology if you can't do math.
Okay. Well, it's you've got your history-based side of it, and you've got your biology, which is of the sciences a much less math-heavy one.
Yeah, that's right. There are applications for the other stuff. And there's some wild stuff that's being done now on a chemical or molecular level with archaeology. I understand the conclusions that come out of those studies, but I understand nothing about the process. But yeah, if you're just not a math fan, that's all right, because basically all you got to be able to do for basic archaeology, which is the majority of what folks do, is can you count to 100? Because you're counting your steps while you're walking, or you're working out stuff on a measuring tape. It's not a math-heavy world.
Yeah.
It's more of a, work with the dirt, work with the stuff that comes out, artifacts, and analyzing them. That doesn't require hefty math, which was
Right. But
sell.
the skills that they do want is, observational skills.
Absolutely.
So observational skills, good ability to record things, I would think.
For sure. Organizational skills are, I'd say, crucial, because and so that's a good point. Record keeping is really the key to good archaeology.
Okay.
Because archaeology is the one science or social science that simply doing the science destroys the stuff you're studying, right? You're taking things out of context. It can't be reconstructed. So to be able to understand the relationships within an archaeological site between artifacts and people or things require you to be organized like nobody's business.
Okay.
Because the only thing you've got to rely on, months later, years later, when you're interpreting what you found, are those notes that you took.
Yeah, like this piece of rock was found in this location.
Correct.
This pot was over here, and the bone was over there.
Yep.
Found with this kind of soil around it, or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, yesterday I was going through some boxes of bones, doing some interpretation, and one of the things I scribbled out in my notes was, where are the field notes? What was the context of this thing?
Okay.
So yeah, that I suppose is an inescapable thing. Good organizational skills, work on that. That's going to be a good thing for you. And an interest in history is probably good, but it's not necessary.
Okay.
And an interest and being good at math and science is also great, but it's not necessary.
Okay. And then as far as somebody who's interested in law, since that's the other side of your coin, what would you recommend for someone who's interested in possibly practicing law or dealing with law?
So I think, again, keep an open mind, because there are so many ways that you can use that law degree. And like we were saying before, there are real uses for those science backgrounds. So if you love science, but you also have some interest in doing stuff with inventions, really, then working that science background to get an undergrad degree in science and then go to law school to do patent work or something like that, or biomedical law, is a good thing to do. But again, since that one's such a varied thing, you can, if you are good at art and that's your passion, there's plenty of space in the law for that too. And in fairness, there's plenty of space in archaeology for it as well. Matter of fact, my daughter is an art major, and she just designed the book cover for my first archaeology book. So
Yeah.
Both of the fields really are kind of an all-inclusive, everybody can find and make their own path kind of thing. And I think inquisitiveness is it for both of them.
Right.
Just a general fascination with how things operate in the world. Again, it doesn't hurt to have a science or engineering background for any of them.
Right.
But it's not necessary.
Cool.
Writing and reading, I think that, in fairness, if you hate reading and writing, maybe these professions may be not your thing. But I didn't like to read when I started, and now that's all I do with my free time, whether it's fiction or non-fiction.
You found the books that you're interested in.
The books that I was
That's what I'm always
interested
telling
in.
my students. They say they don't like to read. I say, you don't like to read the books that you've read so far.
That's right. That's exactly correct.
Yeah.
And now it's a passion.
Yeah.
So, but I'd say that those are the only requirements. Writing and reading for both of those professions probably should be competent at least.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I want to applaud you a little bit for doing the thing that we tell our students every day. The school motto is find your passion, build your future. And you've done that. You've done that. You chased your interests to create a future for yourself, create a job. So I really appreciate you coming and sharing that with us.
Oh, thank you for the invitation. That's been fun.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. You've put things in perspective that I didn't even realize. Yeah, I had just chased my passions and found what I wanted to do and liked doing. And you can do that. It's cool.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do it. So that's our Wildcat Career Chat. My name is David Bennett. This was Dr. Ryan Seidemann. Thank you for watching. And remember to find your passion and build your future.